Hi, these are the most interesting historical photos that I could find. Let's go! This aerial view shows the Bridge Creek and Moore tornado path through an Oklahoma City neighborhood in 1999. Rows of homes were left as bare foundations, while the street grid stayed clearly visible. On May 6, 1986, a bike race went on in Kyiv, while air from Chernobyl was moving toward the city. Many people watched from the roadside before the full danger was clearly known. In 1945, a Japanese Fu-Go balloon weapon crossed the Pacific and reached Oregon. Near Bly, one woman and 5 children found it in the woods, becoming the only people lost to enemy action on the United States mainland during the Second World War. In 1989, a young West German girl pointed at a fresh opening in the Berlin Wall. Uniformed East German men stood above her as one of Europe's strongest borders began to lose its power. This photo shows a parachute jump from El Capitan in Yosemite on October 23, 1999. The jump became widely known because the parachute did not open as planned. In 1941, Italian and German officers studied attack plans in Libya during the North African campaign. The map table shows how desert fighting depended on roads, ports, and long supply lines. In May 1958, a civil rights leader shook hands with the first African-American graduate of Little Rock Central High School. His graduation became a major milestone after months of national attention on school integration. In 1943, Lockheed P-38 Lightning aircraft were moved through the streets of Liverpool, England. Their twin tail shape made them easy to recognize, even when hauled slowly through a city road. In May 1943, Japan's Prime Minister visited a Manila classroom where Filipino children were learning Japanese. The lesson was part of Japan's wartime push to spread its language and message across occupied Asia. The Nuremberg trials used an American executioner whose claimed experience was later questioned. Several final sentences were reported to have gone wrong because of short ropes and a small trapdoor. In 1923, museum taxidermist George Marshall worked on historic animal trophies from the White House. The room held antlers, horns, and mounted heads that had once been preserved for official display. In 1918, Hog Island Shipyard in Philadelphia advertised for 8,000 laborers for government shipbuilding work. The sign promised steady pay for a 10-hour day, while America rushed to build ships during wartime. In the 1970s, children in Tychy, Poland, played on a huge concrete slide shaped like a city monument. Its heavy design matched the apartment blocks around it, making the playground look built for another age. In 1943, a Hollywood actress posed for artist Zoe Mozart during work on the poster for The Outlaw. The finished artwork became one of the film's most recognized publicity images. Around 1912, General Electric was already testing charging stations for electric cars. This studio photo shows that electric car charging existed more than a century before today's plug-in vehicles. In 1962, this photo is said to show an American president with a cigar. One famous story says he secured 1,200 Cuban cigars just before approving the United States trade ban on Cuba. On May 5, 1945, Prague rose against German control as the Second World War was nearly over. Armored vehicles moved through the old city while the fighting for Prague unfolded in its final days. On May 5, 1980, Britain's Special Air Service entered the Iranian embassy in London after a 6-day siege. Television cameras captured the balcony moment, turning the operation into one of the most watched security actions of its time. On May 5, 1961, Freedom 7 carried Alan Shepard on the first American human spaceflight. The flight lasted about 15 minutes and reached space before landing in the Atlantic Ocean. During the Italo-Ethiopian conflict of 1935 to 1936, an Ethiopian local leader submits to Italian troops in the field. Italy used such scenes to show control, while Ethiopian resistance continued across the country. In April 1939, Adolf Hitler was photographed on his birthday beside a German shepherd. A little over 4 months later, Germany invaded Poland, and the Second World War began in Europe. In 1951, the Buster Jangle Easy test rose over the Nevada desert during an American atomic trial. The white lines on the ground marked test paths and measurement points around the blast area. In 1961, Alan Shepard stands on the recovery ship after the Freedom 7 mission, the first American spaceflight with a person on board. His trip lasted about 15 minutes and ended with a pickup in the Atlantic Ocean. In March 1961, downtown Las Vegas stretched in a straight line through the desert valley. The photo shows the city before its later skyline, with low buildings, open land, and mountains beyond the streets. In 1930 Chicago, a woman worked as the live voice of the speaking clock. Before automation arrived in 1937, she announced the exact time every 15 seconds. In 1922, visitors reached Ranararaku, the Easter Island quarry where most moai were carved from volcanic rock. Many famous moai have full bodies under the soil, and some stand more than 30 feet tall. In 1986, Full Metal Jacket was filmed mostly in England, not Vietnam. Kubrick turned a ruined London gasworks into the city of Hue and imported palm trees to complete the illusion. In 1985, this rock legend watched his own face on television inside his home. That same year, his band played a 20-minute Live Aid set that became one of the most famous broadcasts in rock history. In 1961, John Bulmer photographed the Black Country when homes still stood beside power plants and heavy industry. The region's name came from coal soot and furnace smoke that darkened its towns during the industrial age. In the 1980s, many Soviet shops still used an abacus beside the cash register for daily sales. A skilled cashier could check totals by hand faster than many customers expected. The silent film star kept a huge Christmas tree up all year at his Green Acres estate in Beverly Hills. He kept adding ornaments over the years, turning one holiday tree into a permanent room-sized collection. In September 1992, Pearl Jam played a free show at Seattle's Magnuson Park. After 10 made them one of America's fastest rising rock bands. More than 70,000 people came, showing how quickly a club-level group had turned into a festival-sized force. On July 8, 1941, Finnish soldiers drove a captured Soviet T-28 through Lappi, Finland. The rare multi-turret tank was valuable to Finland, which reused captured Soviet armor because its own tank force was small. On August 19, 1917, Boesinga was near the Ypres front, one of the hardest sectors in Belgium. Even in dugouts, soldiers kept shaving because mud, lice, and inspections made grooming part of daily discipline. During Argentina's Dirty War, families confronted officers in public while searching for relatives taken by the military government. Human rights groups estimate that up to 30,000 people were never returned between 1976 and 1983. In 1940, Norway's Women's Work Relief packed aid parcels in central Oslo as war pressure reached daily life. The group helped families and children when food, work, and safety were becoming uncertain. In 1944, New York's Maltese community gave President Franklin D. Roosevelt a scroll in the Oval Office to thank him for honoring Malta. The island had received the George Cross in 1942 for the courage of its people during one of Europe's hardest wartime sieges. In 1903, the Wright brothers made a 12-second flight that opened the age of aviation. At the same time, frontier outlaws were still active, so airplanes in the Wild West briefly shared the same America. In 1971, Ray Tomlinson sent the first networked email while the Vietnam War was still on television screens. The same year, the @ sign entered digital life. Soldiers were still moving through rice fields, far from the computer labs. Coca-Cola began in 1886 as a drugstore tonic sold for 5 cents a glass in Atlanta. Only 2 years later, London was shaken by the Whitechapel case, which still has no confirmed name behind it. While Union soldiers camped in America, London opened the world's first underground passenger railway in 1863. Its first trains ran on steam under the streets, filling the tunnels with smoke before electric trains arrived decades later. In 1918, a young Assistant Secretary of the Navy stepped from a seaplane in France during the final months of the First World War. Only 14 years later, he entered the White House and led America through the Great Depression. At San Bruno in April 1942, Japanese-American families were sent to Tanforan, a former racetrack turned detention center. Many first slept in converted horse stalls before being moved inland under Executive Order 9066. In 1937, Valencia was serving as the capital of Republican Spain when air raids reached the city. Crowds gathered outside morgues as the Spanish Civil War moved from battlefronts into civilian streets. In the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan held public night ceremonies, not only hidden meetings. At its peak, the group claimed millions of members and marched openly through American cities. In 1885, Edward Livingston Trudeau opened the Adirondack Cottage Sanitarium, later known as Trudeau Sanatorium, in Saranac Lake. Its main treatment was fresh mountain air, rest, and separate cottages decades before antibiotics changed tuberculosis care. On November 17, 1957, police entered Ed Gein's farmhouse in Plainfield, Wisconsin, and found a crime scene that stunned investigators. The case later influenced Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and The Silence of the Lambs. On January 3, 1965, photographer Fred W. McDarrah captured this American protest singer on a New York street with his guitar case. His songs were tied to civil rights rallies, student movements, and the folk scene that shaped public music in the 1960s. In 1974, this future television actor was still working on a construction site before landing the role of the Fourth Doctor. Within months, he became the face of a science fiction series watched by millions in Britain. In 1962, America's First Lady watched a snake charmer during her high-profile visit to India. The trip was part of soft diplomacy at a time when India was being courted by both sides of the Cold War. In 1945, Soviet soldiers covered the Reichstag walls with names, hometowns, and victory messages after Berlin fell. Some of those inscriptions were preserved decades later inside the rebuilt parliament, turning wartime writing into public memory. The New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 and 1812 were so strong that the Mississippi River briefly ran backward and created Reelfoot Lake. Church bells rang as far away as the East Coast, showing how far the shocks traveled through the young United States. In 1966, President Lyndon Johnson's limousine was hit with paint packets during a Washington protest over Vietnam policy. That year, public support for his handling of Vietnam was falling fast, turning even presidential motorcades into scenes of open anger. In November 1917, worker and city militia in Petrograd fought police units that still backed the old order. Russia still used the old Julian calendar, so the revolution known as October happened in November for much of the world. Between 1943 and 1945, American A-20 Havoc crews attacked Japanese airfields across the Pacific. They often aimed for aircraft on the ground because one strike could remove planes before they ever took off. In 1942, the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet practiced wartime safety drills as American cities prepared for possible attacks after Pearl Harbor. Even convents and schools trained with gas masks, showing how far the fear of the war reached into daily life. In 1970, members of the Japanese Red Army faction took control of Japan Airlines Flight 351 and forced it toward North Korea. The plane was nicknamed Yotago, and the incident became Japan's first major aircraft hijacking. On June 5, 1976, the new Teton Dam in Idaho failed during its first filling and released a wall of water into the valley. The flood destroyed thousands of homes and became one of the most costly dam failures in American history. In 1945, British troops near Geesthacht found a German major standing with boys as young as 13 in uniform. By the final months of the war, Germany was sending teenagers into service because its regular army was collapsing. Houdini first made this upside-down water escape famous in the early 1900s after securing his feet in heavy stocks. He kept the method secret so well that the act stayed legendary long after his last performance. Titanic carried 29 massive boilers with 159 furnaces to feed its engines in 1912. Hundreds of stokers worked below deck, shoveling coal around the clock in intense heat to keep the ship moving. In 1919, a failed Boston storage tank released more than 2 million gallons of molasses through the north end. The wave moved fast enough to bend steel beams, and residents said the sweet smell stayed in the area for years. During the Spanish Civil War, a Republican soldier with one hand trained with an 8mm Steyr Mannlicher rifle. The war turned ordinary volunteers and wounded fighters into frontline soldiers between 1936 and 1939. On September 28, 1938, London held air raid drills during the Munich crisis, as many feared bombing could start within days. The sign asked people if they had their own mask, because Britain was preparing civilians for a war that had not yet begun. In 1968, James Earl Ray was arrested at London Heathrow while traveling under a false Canadian name. He was later sentenced to 99 years for the killing of Martin Luther King Jr. In 1945, Soviet soldiers wrote their names and hometowns across the Reichstag after taking Berlin. Some of these messages were later preserved inside Germany's restored parliament as marks from the last days of the war. On January 27, 1967, Apollo 1 burned during a ground test while filled with pure oxygen at Launch Pad 34. The inward opening hatch could not be opened quickly, and the disaster forced NASA to redesign the Apollo spacecraft before the moon missions. On January 31, 1941, Royal Air Force bombers flew a night raid over Brest, one of Germany's key Atlantic ports in occupied France. A 3 or 4 second camera exposure turned the anti-aircraft fire into white lines, showing what crews crossed in the dark. In 1934, South Dakota dust storms could turn midday into near darkness as loose topsoil rose thousands of feet into the air. Some Dust Bowl clouds traveled hundreds of miles, carrying farm soil from the Great Plains as far as eastern cities and the Atlantic coast. By the final year of the Second World War, Hitler Youth teenagers were being trained with Panzerfausts as Germany ran out of soldiers. The sleeve badges marked destroyed tanks, turning one veteran into an instructor for children sent against armor. In 1918, Ku Klux Klan branch groups gathered at night in Northern California with banners, flags, and staged costumes. The photo shows how the group used ceremony and pageantry to make extremism look like a public club. In 1900, the Congo Free State was still the private domain of Belgium's King Leopold II. Armed expeditions helped enforce the rubber system that made the colony infamous around the world. The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 covered about 27,000 square miles and forced hundreds of thousands from their homes. It became one of America's worst river disasters and changed federal flood control for decades. In 1935, a Congolese woman was photographed with raised scar patterns across her back, a body art tradition linked to identity and beauty. The hooked cross shapes on her shoulders were used in many cultures thousands of years before Germany gave the symbol its modern meaning. During China's plague outbreak in 1900, doctors worked with covered faces long before modern protective suits became common. The disease spread along trade routes during the Third Plague pandemic. During the Vietnam War, United States aircraft sprayed Agent Orange to strip forests and crops used for cover. Decades later, dioxin hotspots near former air bases still require cleanup, and exposed families continue to report serious health effects. 17-year-old Walter Lunger lies in an Innsbruck hospital in 1934 after an explosive attack by Nazi supporters left him with a life-changing injury. The photo shows how political violence reached ordinary young people in Austria, before Europe entered its darkest decade. In 1906, sailor Emil Petersen reportedly reached a remote island in the Bismarck archipelago after the Duke Johann Albrecht was lost during a Christmas Eve storm. The strange part is that the islanders did not treat him as an enemy. This photo shows a man in a psychiatric hospital wearing a straitjacket, a restraint once used when staff believed a person could not be safely controlled. What makes the image so unsettling is the quiet setting, because it reflects an older era of mental health care built more on isolation than comfort. American auto workers destroy a Toyota during a protest over foreign car imports at a time when Japanese brands were rapidly gaining ground in the United States. The sign says the message clearly: if cars are sold in America, workers wanted them built in America too. Nevsky Prospect in Leningrad, 1924, after a major flood left the city's most famous street covered with torn-up paving stones. The image is striking because cars still stand among the wrecked road, showing how quickly normal city life was broken by the Neva River. Tajikistan in the Soviet Union, 1970s. A groom fills out the marriage registration papers while the bride sits beside him with her face covered in traditional style. The photo quietly captures two worlds in one room: Soviet bureaucracy and local wedding customs. In 1945, after the Battle of Berlin, German generals stand as prisoners only days after commanding troops in a collapsing capital. Their uniforms and medals still look formal, but the photo captures the exact moment their power had ended. California, 1919. People pose on a stranded whale that had been covered with names and messages like a giant beach monument. The strange scene shows how a rare natural event quickly became public entertainment, long before modern rules kept crowds away. China during the Cultural Revolution, officials accused of following the capitalist road were forced to wear tall paper caps and signs listing their accusations. The photo shows how public shame became a political weapon. Finland, Salo, July 17, 1941. Finnish soldiers stand near Soviet reconnaissance prisoners during one of the harshest early weeks of the Continuation War. The distant camera angle makes the scene even colder. In 1946, Estonian schoolgirl Aili Jogi secretly destroyed a Soviet monument in Tallinn. Her arrest photo later became a striking image of teenage resistance under Soviet rule. Early 1900s. A Romani family is photographed beside their wagon, with daily life built around travel, cooking, and close family work. The image preserves a rare look at a community often recorded from the outside, but rarely understood from within. Early 1900s. This couple posed together at a time when interracial relationships could bring social pressure and legal trouble in many places. That makes the photo more than a portrait. It is a quiet record of people choosing each other anyway. Leningrad Front, June 2, 1942. The crew of a BTD armored railcar poses with a turret taken from a T-26 tank. It shows how Soviet units turned rail vehicles into moving firepower when standard equipment was in short supply. Vitebsk, July 1941. Smoke rises over the city after heavy fighting left parts of the Soviet industrial area burning. The photo captures the first weeks of the German invasion, when entire cities were being pulled into the war almost overnight. Pont-à-Mousson, France, February 1916. School children stand in protective masks during the First World War. The photo shows how even a normal school day near the front could feel like survival training. Nuremberg Prison, 1946. This was Hermann Göring's cell shortly before his scheduled punishment after the war crimes trials. Just 2 hours before it was to happen, he avoided the final public moment by taking poison inside this room. This Central Asian veil, often called a parangi with a face net, could hide a woman so completely that strangers saw almost no personal features. In the 1920s and 1930s, Soviet campaigns against veiling turned clothing like this into a symbol of an older world being forced to disappear. During wartime shortages in the Netherlands, families soaked old paper, pressed it into tight balls, and dried it to burn like coal. In winter, even newspapers and scrap paper became precious because a small fire could mean one warm room for the night. Kuala Lumpur, August 1975. An armed Japanese Red Army member walks with two captives during a major embassy hostage crisis. The standoff ended when Malaysia allowed several imprisoned members of the group to be released and flown out of the country. Western Ukraine, 1941. Women in traditional dress march past German occupation officials under a Third Reich banner. The disturbing contrast is the folk clothing beside political theater, showing how quickly local culture could be used for wartime propaganda. In 1950, Timothy Evans was executed after a trial, now seen as one of Britain's most infamous wrongful convictions. The chilling detail is that the main witness against him, John Christie, was later exposed as the real culprit in the same house, and Evans was pardoned in 1966. The British submarine Resurgam was built in 1879 by inventor George Garrett and used an early steam-powered system with about 4 hours of endurance. Its most surprising detail is that this experimental machine was lost during trials. On August 15, 1995, Christopher Charles Lightsey was silenced in court after repeatedly interrupting the sentencing hearing in a serious criminal case. The photo became memorable because it shows how far a judge was willing to go to keep control of the courtroom. Belarus, 1930s. This Kolyada performer belongs to an old winter tradition with pre-Christian roots, where masked visitors sang, joked, and brought wishes for luck. The strange mask was not just for fear, it helped the performer step into a ritual role between everyday life and folklore. Cherbourg, Normandy, summer 1944. American soldiers walk away with captured German sausages after the fight for the vital French port. In a campaign built on supply lines, even food became a trophy worth carrying through the ruins. French Indochina, 1952. A Foreign Legion officer sends a field report through a backpack radio while moving through flooded jungle terrain. Before satellites and pocket devices, this heavy set was the difference between an isolated patrol and contact with command. In 1991, this road between Kuwait and Iraq became one of the Gulf War's most controversial scenes after coalition aircraft hit retreating Iraqi convoys. The lasting question was not whether Iraq had lost, but whether the convoy was still a battlefield target while it was already leaving Kuwait. Warsaw, October 1940. A tram marked only for Jews shows how segregation was forced into ordinary city life under German occupation. The most unsettling detail is how normal the scene looks. Kokand, 1923. Uzbekistan's first female tractor driver became a public symbol of women entering mechanized farm work in Soviet Central Asia. The photo is powerful because one machine represented both new technology and a direct challenge to old social rules. On August 8, 1963, Britain's Great Train robbery took about £2.6 million from a Royal Mail train, worth tens of millions today. The masked suspects later became part of British pop culture, turning a real crime into books, films, and lasting public fascination. In the 1880s, Edison's phonograph was so new that people paid a few cents just to hear a machine laugh, talk, or sing. This was an early version of paid audio entertainment, decades before radio, records, and streaming. In 1926 and 1927, Elizabeth Poole was photographed at Dr. Hamilton's home during seances where tables seemed to rise on their own. These images became part of a strange era when doctors, cameras, and spiritualists tried to prove the impossible in living rooms. London, 1969. Thousands gathered in Trafalgar Square to watch Apollo 11 land on the moon, live on a public screen. For many people there, humanity's biggest space moment was not seen at home, but shoulder to shoulder in a city square. In 1935, police escorted Albert Fish, one of the most feared criminals in American history, through a courthouse hallway. His case shocked the country so deeply that his name is still tied to the darkest true crime stories of the early 20th century. While we're looking at these photos, don't forget to write in the comments, which historical shot did you like the most, and for what reason? In autumn 1941, Italian Guastatori in North Africa stood with a British prisoner during the Desert Campaign. These assault engineers were trained to clear mines, cut wire, and break strongpoints before infantry and tanks moved forward. In November 1943, the Barbarigo Battalion set up a Breda Model 37 near Anzio and Nettuno, months before the Allied landings there. The gun was accurate and durable, but its metal strip feed made every reload slower than belt-fed weapons. In September 1942, Italian Giovanni Fascisti soldiers held positions at Siwa Oasis, deep in Egypt's western desert. Siwa sat far from the main roads, making every gun, shell, and water supply depend on long desert routes. In the winter of 1942 to 1943, Italian troops retreated from the Don after the Soviet breakthrough around Stalingrad. Thousands walked through the snow with poor winter gear, and only a fraction of the Italian Eighth Army returned from Russia. In June 1941, a German field commander visited Italian soldiers at Halfaya Pass on the Egypt-Libya border. The pass was nicknamed Hellfire Pass because control of this narrow desert route could decide who moved toward Tobruk. Fano's Carnival has records going back to the 14th century, making it one of Italy's oldest street festivals. Its strangest tradition is throwing sweets from parade floats, so the crowd becomes part of the show. On May 5, 1980, Britain's Special Air Service ended the Iranian embassy siege in London with an 11-minute assault. The raid was shown live on television and made the unit famous far beyond military circles. These famous conjoined sisters were born enslaved in North Carolina in 1851 and later became international performers. They used their earnings to support their family, local schools, and a church in their hometown. Born in Sudan, Jumbo became so famous that his name turned into a word for anything unusually large. After years at London Zoo, he was sold to Phineas Taylor Barnum in 1882, causing public outrage in Britain. In 1932, former lightweight champion Benny Leonard returned after years away and faced Jimmy McLarnin. McLarnin stopped him in the 6th round, ending the career of one of boxing's first major Jewish sports stars. In the 1940s, many Japanese-American women were moved far from West Coast homes into inland camps and unfamiliar climates. Snow, dust, and wooden barracks became part of daily life for families trying to hold on to normal routines. In the 1930s, Mongolian acrobats were already performing a tradition, later known worldwide, for extreme balance and flexibility. Many performers trained from childhood, turning stage movement into a national art form. In 1968, Poland's communist government used an anti-Zionist campaign to force about 25,000 Jews out of the country. Many were stripped of citizenship papers and left with one-way travel documents instead of passports. In the 1850s, a clear smile in a daguerreotype was unusual because long exposure times made people hold still. This small metal plate preserved one relaxed face from an era when most portraits looked stiff and serious. In 1929, this child was photographed with his father decades before he became Pakistan's military ruler. His government later reshaped the country through strict Islamization policies and stayed in power until 1988. In 1949, Budapest hosted the Second World Festival of Youth and Students as Hungary tightened into a one-party communist state. Matyas Rákosi used mass youth events like this to present Soviet-aligned rule as joyful and international. In 1914, Charlotte of Belgium was still alive almost 50 years after Mexico's short-lived empire collapsed around her. She had once crossed Europe seeking support for Emperor Maximilian, then spent 6 decades almost entirely outside public life. During the Second World War, Jean Haber escaped a Luftwaffe airbase by flying a German aircraft to Britain. He then joined the Free French Forces and died in action 2 years later. In 1932, Jimmy McLarnin stopped former lightweight king Benny Leonard in the 6th round. Leonard had ruled boxing in the 1920s, so the loss became the harsh final page of a legendary comeback. From 1941 to 1945, Ante Pavelic led the independent state of Croatia, a German-aligned puppet state with its own brutal camp system. It was one of the few regimes in Europe that ran camps for children, including Sisak and Jastrobarsko. In 1933, Bert Oldfield's head injury in Adelaide became the most explosive moment of the Bodyline cricket series. The incident pushed Australia and England into a sporting crisis so serious that politicians had to calm it down. In 1885, this Cree chief was photographed after trying to protect his people during Canada's tense western expansion. More than a century later, Canada formally cleared his name after he had long been treated as a rebel. In the 1920s, an Italian fascist leader stood beside samurai armor given to him by a Japanese admirer who had joined Italy's far-right circles. The gift shows that links between Rome and Japanese ultranationalists were forming long before the Axis alliance. In April 1931, a United Dairies milkman in Maida Vale still used a pony cart for daily rounds through London. Before home refrigerators became common, fresh milk delivery was a normal part of city life, and some milkmen also carried butter, cream, and groceries. In 1939, many rural New Mexico families still drew water by hand, while cities were already expanding electric service. This photo was part of a federal record of farm life during the Great Depression. In 1923, Baltimore and Ohio passengers tested radio listening on a moving train, turning travel time into live news and music time. The bulky headphones and horn speaker came before car radios became common, when radio itself still felt like a machine from the future. In 1972, the acting head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation was photographed lifting weights at age 56. A former boxer who avoided smoking and drinking, he resigned the next year as the Watergate scandal closed in. On May 5, 1961, this astronaut waited inside his Mercury pressure suit before the Freedom 7 launch. His short flight made the United States the second country to send a person into space. In 1893, 19-year-old Winston Churchill was photographed as a cadet at the Royal Military College, Sandhurst. He entered Sandhurst after failed attempts and later used Army service as his first step toward political fame. In 1942 or 1943, Russian Cossacks serving with German cavalry rode across the Ukrainian steppe under a skull banner. Some Cossack units fought for Germany against the Soviet Union, turning the Eastern Front into a war inside a war. On May 4, 1945, Denmark heard the German surrender over British radio, and Copenhagen erupted the next day. One Danish island, Bornholm, was not free yet and stayed under Soviet control until 1946. In August 1914, Second Lieutenant Sergei Ivanovich Simankin entered the First World War with Russia's 98th Yuriev Infantry Regiment. He fell near Verdeln in East Prussia on August 7th, only days after the war had opened on that front. In 1903, Bertha Libecka was photographed at Nebraska State Penitentiary after becoming known as Fainting Bertha. Her trick was to collapse into wealthy men's arms in crowds, then empty their pockets before they understood the act. In 1850, Jerome Bonaparte became the only brother of Napoleon known to be photographed. He had once been made King of Westphalia, but lived long enough to enter the camera age after Napoleon's empire was gone. In 1954, Molly Picon, one of Yiddish theater's biggest stars, turned a studio prank into publicity with a bicycle and a huge Great Dane. By then, she had been famous for decades, helping bring Yiddish stage humor to American film and television audiences. On October 3, 1987, two Soviet Mi-24 Hind helicopters landed inside Pakistan near Chitral during the Afghan War. Their Russian crews were taken into custody, giving Pakistan a rare close look at one of the Soviet Union's most feared attack helicopters. In May 1943, KG-66 crews trained at Châtellerault Airfield in occupied France with a Dornier 217K1 behind them. The unit helped other aircraft find targets at night, so the runway lamps were part of training for darkness. In 1942, Italy's Bersaglieri troops in Libya were recognized by the black feathers on their helmets. The Trieste Motorized Division fought in the Desert War, where speed, water, and fuel often mattered as much as courage. On May 5, 1915, the Lusitania was nearing Ireland, near the end of its voyage from New York to Liverpool. 2 days later, a German submarine struck it, turning one luxury crossing into a world-changing disaster. Aboard HMS Amir, sailors had to disarm a damaged Grumman Hellcat before they could move it from the carrier deck. On small escort carriers, one block deck could stop launches and landings, so every accident became an urgent shipwide problem. Near Fremont in November 1918, a British Whippet tank lay beside an airfield used by Australian flyers. Whippets were built for speed after a breakthrough, but many still failed in mud, shellfire, and rough ground. In May 1939, a German newspaper delegation toured Japanese-ruled Korea as Berlin and Tokyo drew closer before the war. In Seoul, they were welcomed with swastika flags, shrine visits, official receptions, and school events built around German propaganda. In 1926, Harry Houdini drew a huge crowd by performing a public escape above Broadway and 46th Street. It became one of his final famous street stunts, made to turn the city itself into a theater. During the Crimea retreat, Romanian IAR-39 aircraft flew low reconnaissance and support missions over the Black Sea. Only 415 were built, making each surviving photo a rare look at Romania's smaller wartime air force. In 1907, Emperor Franz Joseph met the future Emperor Charles on the steamer Marie Valerie during a visit to Prague. The boat was docked at Karlin Port on April 28 with Prince Georg Christian of Lobkowicz also on board. In 1965, Marshal Georgy Zhukov appeared in Moscow for the 20th anniversary of the Soviet victory. He was one of the most decorated commanders in Soviet history. This Italian Kant Z 1007 bis aircraft was forced to land on an Aegean island in the winter of 1942. The type was known for its wooden frame and 3 engines, which made it unusual among wartime aircraft. In April 1917, a sudden disaster at the Eddystone Shell Plant in Pennsylvania took 139 lives, many of them women workers. About 18 tons of black powder set off the chain reaction, yet the plant reopened within 2 weeks. In 1946, the Baker test at Bikini sent 7-foot waves rolling toward the beach during Operation Crossroads. The cruiser Salt Lake City and the battleship Nagato were still visible through the pale test mist on July 25, 1946. At Levico, an Austro-Hungarian shock trooper tested an extreme throwing drill during training. Levico was in the Trentino front area, where mountain units practiced fast, close-range tactics in the First World War. In August 1983, East German Coast Guards patrolled near the Dornbusch Lighthouse on Hidden Sea Island. This quiet Baltic island was watched by the Border Brigade coast of the Volksmarine during the German Democratic Republic era. On November 20, 1950, soldiers of the 2nd Infantry Division worked north of the Chongchon River during the Korean War. A squad leader pointed out a North Korean position to his crew as the front was shifting fast. During the 1987 filming of Predator, 3 cast members relaxed off-camera in a rare behind-the-scenes moment. The tallest performer was over 7 feet 2 inches and worked inside one of cinema's most famous creature suits. In the 1920s, a Ford Model T could turn into a tiny roadside home with a fold-out side camper. Early motor campers often used wooden rooms, beds, and storage years before modern travel vans became common. Sverre and Faye Brothen built one of the most devoted private circus collections in America. Their passion preserved costumes, photos, posters, and stories from traveling shows that often vanished after the season ended. In 1894, 28-year-old Robert Leroy Parker was photographed before the world knew him as Butch Cassidy. His famous name came from his early work as a butcher and from the surname of his mentor, Mike Cassidy. Captain Einar Mikkelsen and engineer Ivar Iverson survived 28 months alone in the Arctic after their ship was lost to ice. They were searching for records from Mylius Ericsson's 1906 expedition when the mission turned into a test of endurance. In 1918, police officers wore face coverings as influenza spread through crowded cities around the world. The outbreak reached about 1/3 of all people on Earth and pushed governments to take public health rules more seriously. This blurry entrance led to Jonestown, the remote Guyana settlement that shocked the world in 1978. More than 900 People's Temple members lost their lives there after United States Congressman Leo Ryan came to investigate the commune. In December 1937, Nanjing became the center of one of the darkest chapters of the Second Sino-Japanese War. The crisis lasted about 6 weeks, and many historians estimate between 200,000 and 300,000 lives were lost. After the Indian Removal Act of 1830, Native families were pushed from their homelands in the southeastern United States toward land west of the Mississippi River. The Cherokee journey became the best-known symbol of this removal, with harsh conditions taking many lives along the route. In 1915, Armenian families in the Ottoman Empire were forced from their homes and sent on long marches toward the Syrian desert. Historians estimate that up to 1.5 million Armenians did not survive the deportations and harsh conditions. In 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory disaster exposed how locked doors and weak safety rules trapped workers high above New York City. The tragedy took 146 lives and helped force major workplace safety reforms across the United States. In 1947, British India was split into India and Pakistan, creating one of the largest forced migrations in modern history. More than 14 million people crossed new borders, and up to 1 million lost their lives during the upheaval. In 1994, camps around Goma in Zaire filled with Rwandan families who had crossed the border in huge numbers. Crowding and unsafe water helped cholera spread within days, making clean water the most urgent need. After President Woodrow Wilson had a major stroke in 1919, Edith Wilson controlled access to him and filtered official papers. Some historians call her the first female president because she quietly shaped decisions until 1921. Mary Seacole was a Jamaican-born nurse who went to the Crimean War after British officials refused her help. She opened the British Hotel near Balaclava, where soldiers could get food, rest, and care close to the front. On February 24, 1942, a Japanese-Canadian family in British Columbia waited for transport after being ordered from their home. After the Second World War, many families never recovered the property they had left behind. In early 1942, two friends of Japanese ancestry played one final game in San Francisco before being sent away from home. Families were told to bring only what they could carry to the government relocation centers. On September 18, 1944, British glider pilots guarded captured men from the German Hohenstaufen Armored Division near Arnhem. Their failed push came during Operation Market Garden, when control of the bridge became the key prize. These Lancashire Fusiliers were photographed near Beaumont Hamel during the First Battle of the Somme. The battle began on July 1, 1916, and became one of the largest battles of the First World War. During the Second World War, British children carried gas masks because the country feared poison gas attacks. Millions of masks were issued across Britain, even though the feared gas attacks never came. In 1945, Manzanar stood in the California desert as one of 10 camps where Japanese Americans were held during the Second World War. More than 10,000 people passed through Manzanar before it closed later that year. Swedish conscripts were kept on base after their service had officially ended, ready for new orders. Warsaw Pact forces entered Czechoslovakia on August 20th and 21st, 1968. On October 24, 1929, crowds packed Wall Street as stock prices fell sharply in New York City. The day became known as Black Thursday and helped mark the start of a major economic crisis. This rare photo is linked to the woman later known as India's Bandit Queen, a figure surrounded by fear, legend, and politics. She entered India's parliament in 1996 after years of national attention. In 1914, Alexander Berkman spoke to a packed May Day rally in Union Square, New York. He was a well-known radical writer and organizer, and the photo was taken just months before the First World War began. In the 1950s, a health campaign in Borneo caused a strange chain reaction that reduced the number of village cats. When rats became a major problem, the Royal Air Force reportedly parachuted cats into remote villages to restore balance. At the Battle of Taiyuan in 1938, Chinese troops used desperate close-range tactics against Japanese tanks. This photo shows a soldier being fitted with hand grenades for a last resort anti-tank mission. I will be very grateful for your subscription to the channel. Every day I try to tell you about such interesting historical photos.